wander by you and look and see what's interesting. In one case, I'll give you an example of this. About 10 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, there was more and more public discussion, more and more media discussion, media coverage about climate change. I'm using this illustration basically to get your attention, but I think for people who lived in developed countries or somewhere other than where polar bears live, initially there was reaction from many people, including from many educated people, wondering, well, what does this have to do with me? I don't really care about what happens to polar bears. But I think gradually, more and more people started to realize that this is basically an early warning sign for other things that are happening. And so my reaction was that, well, this is interesting. I'm not quite sure how this relates to me, but maybe I should keep my eyes open, I should keep my ears open, and try to figure out what role could I play having to do with this. And so about 15 years ago, I noticed that I was starting to get invited to meetings in Los Angeles from representatives of organizations who were trying to figure out what could be done within California about climate change. Even though there aren't a lot of polar bears in California, I think people in California were starting to realize, even though we don't have polar bears here, that the decisions we make, the resources we use, the way we live, the way we build cities, the way we move around with our transportation systems does have some impact with the production of greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe therefore there's something that can be done about this, even if we don't have polar bears here in California. And so one of the meetings that I was invited to by a stranger was a meeting of a new nonprofit organization called Climate Plan, which was trying to persuade decision makers in state government that there was a connection between climate change, land use, and transportation. This was based on the idea that the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in California comes from the use of vehicles, trucks and cars like the ones you drive, you and I drive. And that much of the use of these vehicles has to do with the land use patterns that we adopt, which might require somebody to drive their own car a long way, thus using fuels that burn fossil fuels and which can produce greenhouse gas emissions. So this organization, Climate Plan, wanted to have an impact in state government. And eventually, I learned, they were looking to hire a consultant in Southern California who could start to organize support in Southern California for the idea that land use and transportation have something to do with the production of greenhouse gas emissions. Eventually, this led to the passage of a law in California, Senate Bill 375, which starts to move in the direction of getting local decision makers and regional decision makers to think about the connection between land use decisions, transportation decisions, and greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that basically just I stumbled into because I was starting to get interested in climate change. I was looking for a way to get involved, and along came this organization that actually employed me for several years as a consultant, helping them build support. Here's another example from my own experience. As I mentioned to you, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I assumed that most of my career would be spent here in Los Angeles, or maybe in California, but primarily domestic. Although Cantonese was the first language I spoke until I was about 5 years old and started going to kindergarten, I don't speak Chinese. I don't have many relatives in China, and although I felt some ethnic connection, China wasn't really anything I was very interested in. In the mid-1990s, I was teaching the undergraduate introduction to urban planning at USC, and at one point USC asked me to be a co-instructor for a graduate course of students in planning, traveling to China for 2 weeks to work in conjunction with a group of Chinese graduate students. I've been to China as a tourist, but I've never really been there as, quote, a planner, in the sense of thinking about urban problems. And I got there, and as those of you who know what Chinese cities are like these days, there are some enormous problems relating to traffic, relating to growth, relating to air pollution, as I tried to show you earlier. And I started to think, well, maybe there's an opportunity I could do something about this. I met a lot of planners and architects and local officials in China who recognized that Chinese cities were not developing in a very sustainable way, but they didn't know what to do about it. And they, to me at least, seemed very hungry for advice or help. So I thought maybe what I should do is organize a nonprofit organization based in the United States, but which could send urban planners and other experts to China to help them, especially the second-tier cities, the cities of 500,000 people or fewer, which are not fully built out, to figure out how to avoid duplicating the mistakes made by American cities. At one point, I was invited to a dinner at the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. I sat next to the designer of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Maya Lin. If any of you have ever seen that, I had an opportunity to sit next to her at this dinner at the Chinese embassy. She and I were sitting there with some people from the embassy, and she's trained as an architect, I'm trained as a planner. We decided to try to persuade our fellow dinner guests that China was making some terrible mistakes in the way that cities were being designed and built. But that it wasn't too late, and that China does have time and an opportunity to develop its cities in a better way. So Maya Lin and I tried to make this case to the Chinese people sitting around the table. The reaction, especially from one member of the embassy staff, was, "What gives you Americans the right to come tell us Chinese people what mistakes to make?" And basically what they tried to argue was, we'll decide what mistakes we want to make. It's not for you to tell us what our mistakes are. So we backed off and changed the subject to something else like the food on the table. But it had a big effect on me. And so for a while, I thought maybe there are people there who would be receptive to trying to get help avoiding duplicating the urbanization mistakes of North America and Western Europe. And I was able to find a lot of officials and university people in China who said they were eager to get the help. But I completely failed at trying to raise money from American foundations who said that they were interested in environmental problems in China. I completely failed to raise any money to support doing it. So I gave up the idea. I kept going over there occasionally to give talks, but meanwhile life goes on and I went on to something else. More recently, here's something else. One of the subtexts is the person who you have as your college roommate might have a big impact on your future career. My example of this is someone who was my roommate in the summer of 1971 when we were both student interns in Washington, D.C. Is John Laird, who went on, after we were college students together, he went on to become the mayor of Santa Cruz, a member of the state assembly, the Senate, and then under Governor Brown, he was appointed to be the secretary of the Resources Agency. But I hadn't talked to him for years. We were out of touch with each other. Suddenly, one day, actually about a year ago, I got a phone call from his office saying that his assistant said he wanted to talk to me. And he got on the phone and he asked me if I'd be willing to serve on a blue ribbon commission called the California Parks Forward Commission to help figure out new directions for the California state park system. I told him, I've never been camping. I probably visited very few of the state parks. I don't really know what you're talking about. But he said, no, he wanted me on there because what had happened was the state park system, California has one of the grandest state park systems of any state in the United States. There are something like 270 state parks in California, including forests, beaches, deserts, historical sites. But a few years ago, when California was having a budget crisis, Governor Schwarzenegger proposed to start closing state parks as a way of saving money. The poster you see on the left was a banner, was a poster put together by people who are trying to prevent the closure of state parks. And also there were a number of management problems. They lost millions of dollars and couldn't find it. It was very embarrassing. And so the State Department of Parks and Recreation was having a lot of problems. And in response to this, some of the larger foundations in the state, such as the Packard Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Irvine Foundation, and others, thought they should put together private money to figure out new directions for the state park system. So, totally independent of state government, these foundations funded this California Parks Forward Commission. My former college roommate, John Laird, called me up to ask me if I would agree to serve on this commission, so I did. Then I discovered they were especially interested in this challenge, which is similar to the challenge we face here at Cal Poly Pomona. That is, the future population of California is likely to be very different than the current population or the previous population in terms of ethnic diversity. And yet, the state parks, if you look at this map, you can't see it very clearly. Many of the state parks are located far away from the major population centers in California. And many of the areas of California that are expected to have the highest rates of population growth, like the Inland Empire, there are hardly any state parks out there. So there's a basic problem, which is we've got this wonderful inventory of great state parks, but the California population doesn't live near many of these state parks. And so what can be done to try to introduce people who don't normally go to state parks to be interested in going to state parks? The co-chair of the commission came up to me, knowing that I'm dean of a college which has a department of architecture, and he said, do you think your faculty and students would be interested? He said he had this idea that maybe a way to get young people and urban residents who don't normally go camping, to get them interested in camping, would be to design innovative cabins using sustainable materials, but cabins that might be suitable for a beach, for a forest, for a desert, where someone would look at the cabin and think, wow, I didn't know a cabin could look like that. And so, after doing a little bit of checking, I found out the answer was yes, that our faculty and students were interested. And so, in the span of 10 weeks, we had a course in the architecture department, a graduate studio, in which I think 15 graduate students came up with about 12 different designs for cabins. This is one you see up here on the right, called the wedge cabin. We got enough grant funding to actually be able to build a life-size model of this cabin. But I hope you'll look at some of the other designs that weren't built. For example, there was a cabin that was designed that looks just like a lifeguard station on a beach. This one I think is designed to be in a forest somewhere, but students designed another one that looks like a lifeguard station, except it's for camping, it's where you can sleep in it. And some former lifeguards who are now senior administrators in the State Department of Parks and Recreation decided they love the one that looks like a lifeguard station, because that's where they used to work. And they want us to do that one. There's another one that looks like a version of an Airstream trailer. You know, those are those big trailers that are made of metal, that are kind of a big oval shape. My wife thought that students really missed an important opportunity, that is to design one that would appeal to baby boomers, that looks like a Volkswagen bus. And especially because I remembered my former roommate, John Laird, used to own a Volkswagen bus, and so it especially would have appealed to him. Anyway, the cabin was there was enough money to build one model cabin. And so this was built, it was built at a factory in Arizona. Professor Juntel Lin taught the course in architecture, supervised it. It was carried by truck up to the State Fair in Sacramento. So earlier this summer, this cabin was on exhibit. People loved it so much that some people walked up and said, I love it so much, I want to buy one right now for my house. The problem is, it's not available. So, but eventually, the goal is to make these cabins available in state parks, available to you and me to go camping. and to achieve the goal of getting young people, urban residents, and others who don't think about going camping in the state park to go there. So this cabin was at the state fair earlier in the summer. We moved it down to the LA County Fair in September. Right now it's sitting in storage, but the plan is to move it onto the campus here, probably in January for a couple of months. So you'll have a chance to look at it and walk into it if you like. But again, it gives you an example of revitalizing California state parks is a big challenge, right? And you might be wondering, well, what can I do about that? Well, here's an example of something that some of our students did something about. Here's another example. If you've heard of bike sharing, this refers to programs in Paris, in New York, in San Francisco, seemingly everywhere in Los Angeles, where you can rent a bike and take it from point A to point B, drop it off at point B, thus giving you an alternative. In some of these cities, I believe, the first 29 minutes are free. In other words, you can go on a very short trip from point A to point B without spending any money. And then after the 29th minute, you then get charged an hourly rate. So Professor Michael Fox of the Department of Architecture was I think he was in Tianjin. He was in a Chinese city that has a bike sharing program. And he sent me an email message saying, how come we don't have something like this at Cal Poly Pomona? Now, it reminded me that about a year earlier, I was contacted by some students who were bicycle activists on this campus, who said that you may not be aware of this, but in the dormitories at Cal Poly Pomona, students sometimes abandon their bicycles at the end of spring quarter. In other words, there are a lot of bicycles that students just leave behind. And so about a year earlier, students came to me to say, why don't we take those abandoned bicycles and use them as the basis for a bike sharing program we could have on this campus? Students could operate the system, students could design bike racks. Maybe we could actually make this happen. What I learned in response to that was there's a certain amount of resistance to bicycles on this campus. Some of you may know it is not actually legal for you to ride your bike across the campus. It's okay if you want to ride your bike on University Drive, but there are not identifiable bike paths crossing the campus where the quads are, and the official university policy actually discourages the riding of bicycles across the campus. Now, how can this be when we actually, there are a lot of complaints from students about how there isn't enough car parking, and bicycle sharing is not a solution to the lack of automobile parking, but it could provide an alternative for people who need to go from one point to another point on this campus without having to ride a bike. So anyway, Michael Fox came to me to say, why don't we do something like this at Cal Poly Pomona? So now that I have faculty members who are interested, you see the difference, the warning for the faculty members sitting in the front row here is I've learned it's a lot easier to get something like this to happen when a faculty member says that they are interested and want to make something happen. So when Michael Fox got back to China, I put together a meeting with the bicycle expert in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Do Kim, who was very interested. And then I got the guy who is in charge of bicycles from facilities to come to the meeting. He was interested, although he didn't have the power to make it happen. So we're actually starting to have some discussions about how to do this. There are a lot of practical problems that have to be solved. For example, somebody said, what do you do if you take one of the abandoned bicycles from the dorms at the end of the spring, and then in the fall, one of those students comes back and says, that student is riding my stolen bicycle, or that student stole my bicycle. What do we do about that? How do you settle the legal rights over who owns these abandoned bicycles? And who's going to take responsibility for maintenance? And should there be some kind of membership fee? Should there be, even if the use of the bicycles is free, should the users be required to put some money down? And how do you prevent theft? So there are a lot of issues like that we have to deal with. If you're interested, let me know, because I think that it will be important to show student support for this. That is, we don't want the administration to think that it's just one of the deans and a few professors who want to make this happen. But if students really want to make this happen, then I think there's a possibility. So again, this is one more example of something you could get involved in. You probably can't solve this all by yourself, but again, it shows how through some kind of collective action, something can happen. So, you might be, again, I find some students don't have a lot of imagination and they can't imagine how they can do these things. I wanted to say to you, first of all, multitasking is not really a new concept. And it is possible to, whether you're interested in bicycles, climate change, polar bears, deforestation, or whatever, there are ways in which you can find a way to get involved. I spoke to a student audience on Saturday, and I'll say to you the same thing I said to them on Saturday, which is, you don't necessarily have to follow a traditional career path. For some of you, it may be an option to go out and create your own job. In other words, find something you're interested in. Go out there, wade into the water, see what floats down the water that looks interesting to you, then grab it if it looks interesting, and try to do something with it. It might start with an internship. It might start with some kind of volunteer activity. But it might lead to something else. As I tried to show you from my own example, sometimes there are surprises out there, and you don't really know what's going to happen, and so something like that could happen to you. Also, I specifically chose this photo of this man wearing a lot of hats because you may wear a lot of hats in the future. That is, you might get a job working as an associate in a landscape architecture firm in Orange County, but that doesn't mean that you can't volunteer to get involved supporting a nonprofit organization that raises money to educate girls in Muslim countries. Or that you can't get involved in some way as a volunteer leading walking tours in downtown Los Angeles or doing something else. So in other words, you can wear many hats. And also, I would make the point, especially for the students in the audience, you have many years ahead of you. While your parents or your grandparents may have had jobs or careers which they stayed in for 20, 30, 40 years. My mother, for example, was a bookkeeper in our family wholesale produce business for about 45 years. But my career has been had many more zigzags than my mother or father had. And so similarly for you, I think that you should not assume that the first job you get after you finish school here is a job that you're going to stay in for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. So, in other words, as you look towards your future career, you may have opportunities to do different things. You may not have to get involved in designing a portable Ebola clinic immediately upon graduation, but there may be something coming up a few years down the road where you might have a chance to do something like that, either as a paid job, or as a volunteer, or as an apprentice or an intern. So I'm just asking you at this point to keep an open mind about what your possibilities are, and don't be afraid to wade into the water and look for your opportunities. This is my last slide. Again, some of the more pessimistic or skeptical in the audience may be asking, is this really realistic? So here's a quotation from an inspirational speaker who used to be famous in the early 20th century. Now nobody ever thinks about winning the award. But he wrote, and I'll read this to you, "The pessimist complains about the wind. The optimist expects it to change. The realist adjusts the sails." So, whether you think your natural tendency is to be a pessimist or an optimist, you can still be a realistic pessimist or a realistic optimist, and you can go out there and try to adjust the sails. Okay? Thank you very much. 15 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, opinions, rebuttals. Yes, sir.
Professor Wu, I noticed earlier you were bringing up the fact that some of us should get into the fields already for planning fields that are expected to require degrees. However, the courses that are available to us are offered in the middle of the day that prevents optimization of the amount of time we can work. That is, most companies work 9 to 5. Our classes are in the middle of the day. What solutions can be done in order to provide us with more options in order to help us gain our full-time jobs early? Some of us already have associate degrees that make us qualified for full-time jobs. I myself do as well, but must turn down these opportunities because I don't have any other options for my course availability.
Okay, let me try to repeat your question. I think what you're saying is that for students who work during the day, especially for students who already have an AA degree or have some background and are working in the real world, that there are courses you wish you could take which are scheduled during the middle of the day, but you can't take them because you're working or doing something else. And so you're asking for options in terms of scheduling courses at other times?
Well, actually, it's the other way around. See, the courses that we can take during the day are keeping us from working.
Oh, I get it.
I would like to find a full-time job to support myself and pay for courses. However, with courses being in the middle of the day, that's not an option. There is nowhere in this country we can survive using minimum wage that pays for a house, apartment, and school. Well, what options are being considered to help students find a full-time paying job as well as attend school in the evenings or early in the morning?
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying. In other words, you wish that you could have a job during the day, but instead you can't because there are courses you have to take place during the day.
Yes.
That's basically it?
Yes.
Okay. There isn't an easy solution to this problem. It seems to me that one way to deal with it would be to offer more courses at times other than the regular Monday through Friday schedule, either in the evening, weekends, or online. This doesn't work for everybody, and it doesn't work for every single course. I know that some programs, for example, urban and regional planning graduate courses tend to take place at night because a lot of the students there have jobs during the day. I have heard some students sometimes complain they'd rather not take night courses and they wish those courses were available during the day. But I think, and of course, in addition to there being some students who prefer the daytime courses, there also are faculty who'd rather teach during the day. But I think that if we loosen up some of the traditional definition of a university and try to schedule courses, or to the extent to which students and faculty are interested in moving courses to the evening or the weekend or online, that we ought to be open to those kinds of alternatives. But it probably needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, unless there is a program that decides that a lot of the students who want these courses can only take them if they're on the evening or weekend. So I don't have an easy solution to your problem, but it seems to me the solution is partially scheduling and it's partially doing some things online. Okay? Somebody else? Yes?
So you presented a couple of challenges earlier to the students. I was wondering my involved in designing what challenges you guys are looking at.
Oh, okay. The question is, in response to some of those challenges I threw out during my talk, if a student like this student here wants to do something about it, who can you turn them into? That's a good question. I think potentially there could be some opportunity for some kind of independent study, or there could be a way to do some of these things as an assignment for an existing course. But if you're interested, or if anybody else here is interested in a specific challenge, or if you think of something else related to one of the challenges I put out there, why don't you come talk to me either after this or over to my office, and I can suggest to you some faculty members who might be interested in supervising you to do that. Or it may be possible to do some of these things without any faculty. For example, I think it could be really interesting to get involved with Doctors Without Borders, which is an international organization, but there are people within Southern California who are involved in that organization. And so there might be a way to do it, to actually have an internship with an organization like that, or some entity that might want student assistance dealing with a real-life problem. I mean, so if anybody here is interested, either in terms of any of the specific challenges that I enumerated during my talk, or if I stimulated some other challenge that you just thought of that I didn't think of, I welcome you to talk to me, or you may want to talk to your section leader in ENV101, who may be able to give suggestions about how would you pursue it if you wanted to pursue it. Okay? But I would welcome hearing what you have in mind. Okay? All right. Other questions? Yes, sir. Over here.
I have a question in regards to the skyline.
Yes.
Does there any
Okay. The question is about the new downtown LA skyline policy. Some of you might recall this is something that I was involved in actually since about 2007, trying to remove the requirement for helicopter pads on the top of buildings 6 stories or taller as a safety requirement. That recently has been overturned, so buildings in downtown LA no longer have to have a helipad. So the question is, has there been any further pushback? The answer is, as far as I know, no, there hasn't. And what I'm thinking about is, now that we've gotten this far, I would be very happy if Cal Poly Pomona could basically take ownership of this issue. And I'm starting to think about proposing that we hold a conference in downtown Los Angeles, sponsored by the College of Environmental Design, inviting architects, real estate developers, public officials, members of the public, and others to come talk about what the implications of the new policy would be and what are the challenges of implementing. So far, I'm not aware of any pushback. I imagine there will be some. Actually, there was a deputy chief in the fire department who wrote an op-ed article in the LA Times saying this was a terrible idea that will jeopardize people's lives. So that's the only public pushback that I know about. Okay. All right. Other questions? Anybody else have questions? Oh yes. Okay. I recognize Bradley from section 9.
Lecture, you're going to have a process or
Okay, Bradley's question is relating to the bike sharing idea I mentioned. Is there going to be a class? Frankly, I don't know the answer. It sort of depends on what people want to do. Potentially, there could be a class. Somebody like, maybe I should suggest that Joe Kim and Michael Fox co-teach a class. That could be one way to go. Or there may be students who want to do it as an independent study, or there may be students who just want to be involved as a volunteer. I think there are different ways of doing it. The point that I try to make as the dean is that Cal Poly Pomona can be very flexible. And the way that we try to implement the so-called learn by doing philosophy is that we can move really fast to try to respond to something like a challenge of how to create a bike sharing program. So if you're asking me if you're personally interested, how do we do this? I don't have a specific answer for you yet because, frankly, it isn't developed any further beyond what I just said a few minutes ago. But if you or any other students are interested, we'll involve you in what's evolving, and whether it's a class or just some volunteer group or something else, we'll make it up as we go along. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions out there? No? Nobody else has any questions? All right. Well, anyway, I hope that you got something out of this. Don't forget that the main point I tried to make in the very beginning, which I consider to be something that everybody needs to know, is that for the first time in the history of the world, a majority of the world's population lives in cities. And if I were writing final exam questions, I think a really good final exam question would be, in the face of that fact, what does this mean in terms of your future career? So even if it's not on a final exam, I think it's something you should be thinking about. All right? Thank you very much.